Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donna Hicks, and I'm the chair of the Herbert C. Kelman Seminar. And I just realized it's probably not afternoon in many of the places of the participants who have tuned in here. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening. We're just so happy to have you here. I know there's many people from all over the world joining us today. So welcome to everyone. And would just like to point out that this seminar is co-sponsored by the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. And before we get into, before I get into introducing our wonderful speaker today, I want to make everyone aware that we have a very special person in addition here with us to our speaker, and that's Nicole Bryant. She is the new managing director at the Program on Negotiation, and we're just thrilled to have her with us on the Herbert C. Kelman team. And I also am really thrilled to be able to introduce you, Nicole, to the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. So we are really looking forward to working with you. As I said, we have a wonderful presenter here today. One of our colleagues from the Kennedy School of Government, Rob Wilkinson. And as you know, he's going to be talking about his 4P leadership framework. And we will, I'm sure you're going to enjoy this, and you'll be able also to have you can pose some questions to Rob at the end of this hour. He'll be talking probably for about 35 minutes, maybe 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will open it up to all of you for questions or comments. And you can put those in the Q&A function here below. And I also, before we move on, want to thank Diane Long, Anna Chang, and James Kerwin for helping organize this wonderful event for us today. So Rob Wilkinson, we are, as I said, thrilled to have you. Rob is a lecturer in public policy and leadership at the Kennedy School of Government here at Harvard. And he's a negotiation and leadership specialist where he teaches graduate courses on leadership in complex environments and on negotiation theory and practice. Rob has won several Dean's Teaching Awards at Harvard and also served as a special advisor on negotiation at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology. Previously, he was on the faculty of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and for 8 years he was there as a faculty member. And Rob actively consults for Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, international organizations, and charities, helping them build their negotiation, leadership, and team management skills. Also, just in general, to increase their overall effectiveness. He has more than 25 years of experience in over 50 countries across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Rob worked before overseas for 15 years on a variety of international projects. And this includes spending 3 years in Rwanda, working with Hutu and Tutsi communities, 2 years working with the UN peacekeeping mission in Angola, and 18 months in Laos, consulting on a variety of community development programs. He began his overseas work in Nicaragua in both Sandinista and Contra areas. Rob earned his Master's of Science from Stanford University and his bachelor's from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His latest publication on the 4P framework for strategic leadership can be found, actually you'll be able to find that in the chat section later after the talk. So Rob, I don't want to take up any more of your time. I know people are really anxious to hear your ideas, so please, take over. It's yours.
Well, thank you so much for the generous introduction, and I'm just so delighted to have all of these participants around the globe joining today. It's really an honor and a privilege. And I will jump right in really to the subject for today, which is the question of the intersection, in my mind, between the world of leadership and the sort of academic and scholarly work in that field and the world of negotiation, which is the focus of the program on negotiation, of course. And what I've always found is that there seems to be more collaboration that we could do between these two fields intellectually than we tend to, and we've tried to make an effort on that. I believe we've made some progress, but we could do a little bit more. So I'll just start from the beginning then about my vision about what I've been wanting to focus on ultimately how to build our leadership effectiveness. So we've done some work here in the program of negotiation between the worlds of leadership and negotiation, where we've had some specialists come together, leaders in the Kennedy School and the law school and the business school and other parts of the system, Tufts and Brandeis, et cetera, at MIT. And what I found is that when I really look at the definitions of what we think of as leadership, I see so many overlaps to negotiation and vice versa, but we don't really bring them together. And so my goal was to create a framework that began to do that, and which is what I call the 4P framework, which I'll get into in a moment. I should mention that today what I wanted to do, instead of lecturing in terms of academic content, I will share that information you can read later. I wanted to look at case studies of leaders that we've studied and try to understand how they brought to bear these different skill sets and concepts into a real life problem. So that's what we're going to look at today. So the first thing I want to do is spend some time just talking a bit more about leadership. How do we define leadership? What does it mean to us? And a few different definitions I'll just point to. There's so many. I mean, one of the problems of teaching leadership is you can ask 20 people and you get 40 answers of what leadership means. But here's a few definitions. It's a process of motivating people to work together collaboratively to accomplish great things. Another one, the first job of a leader is to define a vision for the organization. Leadership is the capacity to translate vision into reality. These are all leadership scholars, well-known leadership scholars. So notice that a vision, you're creating a picture of where you want to go in the future, which I think of as projecting a vision. And then the leader's job is to take take that vision into reality. And then here's another one I like. You cannot manage people into battle. You manage things. You lead people. That's Grace Hopper from the US Navy. And one of the sort of myths, I think, that some of my younger colleagues, as they're going through the ranks and becoming more and more senior, but even actually people who are quite senior, somehow think it's so frustrating in this job. If I could just get them to do it, my job would be so much easier. And as I get promoted, one day I'll have that job where I can finally now I'll be on the top of the pyramid. I can just tell people what to do, and then it'll be easy. Bad news is there really is no such job. It's not really like that. We work sometimes even with CEOs, heads of state, the president in the White House. They all feel constrained by other factors, public opinion, boards that oversee them, shareholders. There's no magical job, even in the military, where you just order people to do things and they just go off and do it and you don't have any problem. So that is the challenge of leadership. Here's one more take on it that I wanted to just share. Conversations about leadership often turn into discussions about how individuals can keep large, complex, unwieldy organizations operating reliably and efficiently. That's not leadership, that's management. Leadership is associated with taking an organization into the future. Leadership is about vision, about empowerment, and most of all, about producing useful change. That's our colleague, John Cotter from the Harvard Business School. So again, this is about that last part. Leadership's about vision, projecting a vision, empowering people and connecting with them on a human and emotional level, and producing useful change. So this is what's led me to reflect on where will I find this link between the leadership literature I've been studying for years, and I've been teaching courses on leadership for years, as well as negotiation. How do they intersect? Well, here's where I wanted to just reference James McGregor Burns, widely considered to be one of the founding thinkers in the discipline of leadership as a study, along with our colleague, Ron Heifetz at the Kennedy School, two sort of foundational intellectual thinkers on this. James McGregor Burns wrote a book called Leadership, and he's won National Book Award and Pulitzer Prize on this sort of thinking. Here's one part of that book on leadership. When posed with a hypothetical question, what would a presidential aide say is the one quality characterizing most issues reaching the president? He says, I would say it was conflict between departments, between the views of various advisors, between the administration and Congress, between the United States and another nation, or between groups within the country. labor versus management, or race versus race, or state versus nation. Not that any of this applies to our current situations in the world right now, of course. This is where it boils. This is the crux of the intersection between these two fields, in my view. So this has led me to propose this model of leadership that I have been working on called the 4P framework. And I boil it down to these 4 buckets or sort of domains of leadership that I think that is not necessarily intended to be comprehensive, but absolutely there for all leadership challenges. You can't not have these things present, and that's what we're going to focus on. So let me just quickly touch on them, and then we're going to use some, like I said, a set of case studies for each of these 4. Number 1, perception. The idea is all of the information we receive, we interrogate and filter and interpret in different ways, and that we are inevitably going to look at the exact same thing and perceive them differently. That's how human beings work. That's how their brains work. We have lots of interesting research. I would point to someone like Peter Senge and Don Shawn as great researchers on this. Robert Robinson at the Business School wrote a wonderful set of papers on partisan perception. Our colleagues Doug Stone and Sheila Heen and Bruce Patton wrote a book called Difficult Conversations, which touches a lot on this. So it's inevitable to have multiple perceptions of the same things that we're looking at. Secondly, process, the way in which we engage groups and teams, the order within which we talk to people, the way that we communicate. Process management is widely overlooked often as a leadership challenge. Again, lots of great work there. Richard Hackman is probably one of the biggest thinkers on team dynamics and process management. When I say people, I mean the human and emotional impact that people are experiencing as a result of your leadership. That's something, again, we often overlook. There's a great history. Peter Salovey, one of the early researchers on this question of emotions. Of course, Daniel Goleman wrote Emotional Intelligence. Our colleague Dan Shapiro has written a lot about emotions as a leading expert now. And then finally, projection is the implicit and explicit messages that we are constantly projecting as leaders all the time. One of the clients that I worked with for years was the head of the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, in the US government, John Berry. 1.9 million people at the time reported up into the civil service through him. It was a big management job. And what he used to always say was the second you walk in the door, he would put it as showtime. It's showtime. What does he mean? People are watching everything you do. You know, you go in the elevator, a group of people are around you, you're looking at your phone and not at them. You're projecting a message about what's important to you, your emails, not them. You know, it's showtime everywhere you go. Who do you talk to? Do you sit with people in the cafeteria? Do you just shut yourself in your office? We're always sending messages, and the implicit messages we're projecting can often be even more important than the explicit messages. So I want to break these down in a little bit more detail, like I said, with these case studies. I will just share one graphic that goes into much more detail, which you will not be able to read right now, I know, but you'll be able to get a copy of this PowerPoint and look at it in more detail. I've put in much more specificity the elements that go underneath each one of these 4 Ps. As Donna graciously mentioned, I wrote a paper with my colleague Kim Leary recently. I'll just put it into the chat right now, actually, and it might be in the invite as well, which goes into much more detail about exactly what we mean with all 4 of these Ps. And there's also a podcast series on each one of these, which I will share right now also in the chat, if you want to listen to more detail. But in the interest of fighting ever-present Zoom fatigue, I will not be showing you lots more graphics of theory, but what I will do is talk about how it comes to life with real life leaders. So I've written 4 case studies to look at 4 different kinds of leaders in wildly different environments to show the universal nature of how these 4 Ps show up, and a little specific focus on each of the 4 Ps for all of them, even though they're all present all the time. But there's one case that was really a fascinating one about the Juba peace talks. It's the talks between the government of Uganda and Central Africa and the Lord's Resistance Army, one of the most sort of violent rebel groups in Africa at the time. And I spent, as Donna mentioned, I was 3 years in Rwanda, but I covered the region for Oxfam, the nonprofit. So once a month, I would say, for 3 years, I was up in northern Uganda. Stunning poverty and incredibly difficult reality for people to deal with. And what I wanted to do was write the story of the attempt to build a peace process that might work in that environment. And so the protagonist of this case is the Prime Minister Rugunda, at the time was the Minister of Interior. And the question was, how could we think about working with the other side? In other words, these people who'd committed terrible atrocities, what could we do to try to find some way to bring the groups together? There's going to be a link at the end of the PowerPoint to all the 4 case studies, by the way, as well. You can go to the Harvard case study program and look at this. Many different elements of perception were at play here, one of which was, can you, in good faith, sit down with people who you consider to be evil? A major, difficult question. I would reference the book from our great colleague, Bob Mnookin, one of the longstanding leaders of the program of negotiation here at Harvard Law School, wrote a book called Bargaining with the Devil, just on that very question. It's a very hard one to answer. At the time, the UN humanitarian coordinator was a man named Jan Matson, and he used to say, if you want to help people living in hell, sometimes you have to shake hands with the devil. Not everyone agreed with that approach, though. It was a very interesting case of firsts. So for example, in this particular case, I just talked about sitting down with the enemy. It was the first warrant ever issued by the International Criminal Court for Joseph Kony. And some people said, well, that was the right thing to do to punish a perpetrator of horrific war crimes. Other people said, well, that's an obstacle to achieving peace and resolution of the conflict. And meanwhile, they were balancing, as I mentioned, incredible poverty. So there was a tension between getting peace, poverty reduction, and justice for victims who were abused by this terrible rebel group. Talk about perception issues there. Another one I wanted to introduce today was the idea of the role of social media. So it may, for those of you who could remember, it was in 2012 was the first, literally the first viral video called Kony 2012. It's still on the internet. You can watch it. It's about half an hour. It's a fascinating piece of a nonprofit that tried to create some advocacy work around the role of the Lord's Resistance Army and specifically Joseph Kony to try to sort of bring to bear pressure on containing that rebel group. That was a massive perception issue as well. Some people thought this was great. Some people said this was, again, hurting the peace process. And so inevitably, we have to grapple with the perception challenges there. I wanted to show you a few video clips here to just bring this to life. I will, a trigger warning for anyone who may want to not focus on this for the next few minutes. It is nothing graphic and explicit, but we're talking about a rebel leader who's committed terrible atrocities. And so I want to just touch on this video of Joseph Kony. And those of you who don't remember this, I'm going to show a few seconds of a video clip from the news about when this video took off and how it affected the discussion.
Until this week, few Americans had heard of Joseph Kony or the atrocities he is said to have committed in Central Africa. But watch what happened when a charity posted a video on the internet to raise awareness about Kony and his alleged crimes. On Monday, the video had been viewed 66,000 times. The next day, 9,600,000 views. And today, 50 million and counting. In less than a week, it's become the most viral video ever.
So that's something that is a positive if your focus is on how to raise awareness about this terrible situation. Now, again, you may not remember, some of you, how widely used this video as a strategy, which was called the kind of celebrity strategy. And I'm going to show a little video clip of George Clooney talking about the idea behind this celebrity strategy.
Resistance Army has been a warlord who's just been abducting children for 20 years. But this 76 million views, at least, George, on YouTube last week, you were in the video and you said something pretty remarkable. You want him to be as famous as you or any other celebrity.
Well, you know, that was taken from my comments when we started the Satellite Sentinel project about Omar al-Bashir, because he'd complained that he said, Bashir, who's the head of the government in Khartoum, said that how would Mr. Clooney like it if cameras were constantly following him everywhere he goes? And we said, well, you know, welcome to my world, and I think it should be fair enough that he should enjoy the same amount of celebrity as I do, a war criminal.
Which is a perfectly reasonable strategy. And I think that that had an impact. Yet, guess who was largely opposed to this reasonable strategy from the point of view of the West, were a lot of people in Uganda, and particularly victims of the Lord's Resistance Army were very opposed to this sort of celebrity strategy. So just to look at the other side of the argument, I want to play a little video clip where we'll hear from a young woman who was a survivor of an attack by the Lord's Resistance Army. In fact, to the point where her words are a little bit indistinct partially because of the injuries she suffered. So let's just hear what she thinks about the celebrity strategy.
It's not easy to be a survivor, but I'm glad I able to escape. Maybe the purpose is why I am sitting here. And it's very painful for me to hear that Joseph Kony is right now in the United States is a celebrity. And I ask myself, what is celebrity? The kids that weren't supposed to be a celebrity because they've been through a lot.
So you can just see, I'll stop sharing for a second. You can just see the intensity of the differences of opinion between one well-meaning side of this discussion and another well-meaning side of this discussion. And the takeaway from a leadership perspective is simply the following. The idea that somehow we think this wrong or bad or a problem if the people on your team or in your group disagree about the right way to go. We think, oh, you're not, often we hear people say, you're not a team player. You're not someone who, you're not on board. We're all working for the same organization. We're all working for the same company. We hear that all the time. Guess what that's kind of code for often? You don't agree with what I'm saying here or what we're saying here, so you're not being a team player. A team player means you agree with me. And guess what? The other side is thinking the same thing. Whereas what I would say is it's inevitable, except as a starting point, that there will inevitably be different perceptions. And it's a mistake to think, well, hopefully we can get past all that and I can get on with the real job of leading the team now. No, that is the job of leading the team. The starting point is dealing with those multiplicities of perspectives. So that is, that's the first sort of takeaway for someone who is thinking about being an effective leader. Okay, let us continue. I appreciate the comment about the trigger warning. I will also make one more in a moment, but I'm trying my best to be thoughtful about that. Thank you. The next one I want to focus on is a different case study of a colleague of mine who I consulted for many years with the World Wildlife Fund, and Josefina Braña Varela. She, at the time, was the team leader of the part of the World Wildlife Fund. I got a call saying, hey, do you want to consult with a WWF? And I thought, wait, the wrestling folks? I don't know anything about wrestling. And they said, no, it's the World Wildlife Fund. I said, oh yeah, right, I know them. And there's a team that specifically works on the protection of forests. And for those of us who don't know that much about it, climate change is driven in large part more by forest deforestation and degradation than lots of other things like transport around the world, energy use, et cetera. And she decided that her team, a small team of people scattered around the world, were going to try to go to the Paris Climate Accord discussions and influence the agenda so that forests would be included on the agenda. Remarkably, amazingly, they weren't even on the agenda originally. Kind of strange because they produce more greenhouse gas emissions than anything else. So the challenge was, how could she leverage, as one NGO out of hundreds, and not even like at the top of the organization, at that position as a middle-level nonprofit worker, how could we influence the outcome and the process? And the case study is basically the story of how they do that. I'm going to show you another video clip here. This is just simply explaining why forests are so important for climate change, which is obviously one of the biggest topics for our day. It's a United Nations little 30-second clip to give you a bit of a background about forests.
When forests are cut, burned and converted to land, the carbon stored in the forest's vegetation and root structures is released as carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. An area equivalent to New York City is lost every other day to deforestation, releasing 7 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere each year. This accounts for over 17% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, which is more than the global transportation sector.
So that was just a quick little shot of like why it matters so much. Now, let me just talk a little bit about Josefina and one of the many things she did to gain leverage and influence in the Paris climate talks. And the number one way she did it was process management, our second P. What that meant was working hard on improving processes on the ground in the countries that are most affected by forest deforestation: Brazil, Congo, Indonesia, countries in that sort of landscape, they call it, around the equator of where most rainforests are. And she managed to not only implement really effective local level processes with her team, but also linking them to national and then ultimately international processes. And I want to just give you a little clip here. Some of you I know are Spanish speakers. This is in Spanish. I'll tell you what she says. It's only about 25 seconds, but it makes climate change work. It feels like it's policy work that's a little abstract. It just, I think, makes it come to life a little bit more. So let's just listen to a few seconds of hearing her in her own mother tongue, in her own words, for a second here.
Sobre los procesos de toma de decisiones y los procesos de deterioro de los recursos naturales a nivel local. Involucrar a las comunidades representa empoderarlos para poder proveer datos que nos permitan hacer un diagnóstico más adecuado de las causas de deforestación a nivel local y que por ende contribuya a la toma de decisiones en la planeación de estrategias red a nivel nacional. Desafortunadamente hay retos en el trabajo con el manejo de las relaciones con comunidades.
So what she's saying is we had to think about the processes at the local level to empower communities so that they could take charge of getting their own information. There were also challenges, she goes on to say, about capacity building. But the important point here is that it's not swanning off to Washington and Paris and talking all the time is the only part of influencing as a leader. She had to be out on the front lines. And in fact, when I worked there, I went deep into the jungle with them for many days on end. We took forest walks in the mornings with all the different groups. And there was government people, businesses, local communities. Literally, there were sometimes rebel groups that had to come and sit with us, climate scientists, you name it. And it's frontline work means getting out there and really thinking about how to bring people together. And then when she got to Paris, what she did was very clever use of building coalitions informally so that they were able to respond more quickly and actually understand what the real political dynamics were, rather than the formal coalitions, which were much slower and had to have official press releases, and then very clever combinations of which countries would work together, whether it was maybe Ecuador and Sweden and places that could lobby in different places and be heard in actors that could lobby in different places and be heard in different ways. And then finally, a lot of the forest negotiators from different countries never actually shared resources or information. And she managed to find a way for them to collaborate, say, you go work with these people, you go lobby those people, let's come back together. And they had this informal network called the Nameless Coalition, which had this hugely outsized impact. Long story short, forests were not even on the agenda at Paris. This small team in the middle of an NGO goes there, and in the end, with thousands of players in Paris, actually got this commitment in the final agreement of the Paris Accords, where they talked about action to prevent emissions of greenhouse gases, including forests, and reducing emissions from deforestation. And not only was it in the final agreement, by the way, in the 80-page summary, and ultimately, I understand, in the 6-page communique that went out, they got forests in all of them. Remarkable use of process management to get where they wanted to go. Let's turn now to a totally different topic. And here again, I will offer up a trigger warning. I should mention that these 4 Ps apply in the public, private, nonprofit sector. As Donna mentioned, I teach at the Kennedy School, which is largely a public and nonprofit focused sort of school. So I've picked case studies in those realms, but we also have some great examples in the private sector. I wanted to pick Tarana Burke because it's such a powerful story, the founder of the Me Too movement. And I guess I'll just make a few comments. The first one is that what she wanted to focus on was the role of communities in addressing the problem of sexual assault for, as she would put it, Black and brown young girls, which is a group of people overlooked significantly in this country, in the US. And what she said was really striking to me. She said that, if there's let's say a shooting or something, or a crime that gets committed in a community, people come together and they talk with the police and local authorities and community organizers, make a lot of public statements about how they want to change what's led to that problem. When something happens, like it becomes clear that sexual assault has occurred or is occurring, that doesn't happen. People won't talk about it. We won't come together and have a conversation. So this is an interesting example of, we learn a lot about negotiation skills and how to deal one-on-one and how to deal with negotiation tools in a group. What she would say is, well, we don't have that group together to negotiate with because they don't want to talk about it. There's shame, there's humiliation, there's a history of not talking about that kind of thing. So her first leadership challenge was to make it so that we were able to talk about that question, let alone using all of our great negotiation skills once we get together. And one of the things that she did that was remarkable in my mind, which is quite a powerful shift, is that she did lots of workshops for young women, young Black girls around the US. And what she noticed was that the more this topic was sort of touched on of sexual assault, the more she realized, wow, this is pretty widespread, but they have too many emotional barriers to bring it up even in the little workshop. But it was there and she knew it. So her focus was on, how do I overcome the emotional barrier? What did she do? She made this remarkable choice. One day she told us that she had a workshop, and as usual, you hand out evaluation forms at the end, you fill in what did you think of the workshop, et cetera. And she had this idea to say, you can fill in the evaluation form, or if you want to, you could just, we've talked about sexual assault, you could just write the words "Me Too" on the evaluation form, put it in the envelope, no one has to know who it was. So she said that, she did the workshop, they filled it in, she went back to her hotel room and she said, she dumped it out on the bed and boom, across the board, all of them, "Me Too." And I think her life changed in that moment, her life changed. She said, and some of them wrote their name, by the way, and she said, that's a cry for help. So this is a way to now illuminate, this is the real issue we have to deal with. And then what became very interesting was that Alyssa Milano, the actress, put out on her social media the idea of #MeToo. And what was a very fascinating dilemma here for Tarana Burke was the idea that, there's a great quote that many people refer to in leadership and management by Harry Truman, the former US president, who says, you can accomplish anything you want if you don't care who gets the credit. I love that quote. I think the sentiment behind it is great, which means if your ego is too much in the way and if you're doing it just to get credit, that's not really the motivation you should have for trying to make productive change. Remember John Carter's quote in the beginning, it's about producing useful change. If that's what you care about, it shouldn't be about ego. True. The flip side of that, though, is also that maybe it's not okay that someone else takes the credit, though. I mean, so many of Tarana's friends immediately emailed her and said, this is outrageous. You can't let someone take credit for all of your hard work. So she had a choice to make. Am I going to confront Alyssa Milano? Am I going to just understand and inquire? And she contacted her in a very collaborative way. And of course, Alyssa Milano said, oh my goodness, no, it's yours. You take the credit, I'll support you. And they have a wonderful professional, I think, personal relationship since then. You can see lots of things they've done jointly to promote Me Too. So it's a really fascinating example of how we have to be not overly looking for our own personal credit, but not being afraid to say, hey, that's my work. And she's a beautiful example of marrying those two. The case that I wrote, we called it Leading with Empathy. And I just want to show you one video clip here. Again, one more trigger warning. There's nothing graphic or specific, but it's just a short conversation between Tarana Burke and one of the women that she's supported. And the woman talks a little bit about her experience of working through her survivorship with Tarana Burke. So I'm just going to play this short clip of that conversation.
I'm an organizer now, that's my career, and largely because she's one of the 3 people that invested in me. That was like a remarkable change in my life. So that's how we met. Because I had been sexually, because I had been raped, which is something that I'm new to saying. Because I had been raped, my behavior was erratic and I was being at risk.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation because I think that what I haven't had a chance to do in these last few months is to reflect. Before, people were doing research about how Black girls are hypersexualized, and this is what we saw. It's this way that the world doesn't recognize trauma in Black girls. And so what people would dismiss and say she's troubled or she's this and that, they couldn't dismiss in somebody like Celeste because she's so smart. They couldn't dismiss it in me because I was smart. I think what we've seen in this explosion of Me Too, people always ask me, am I surprised? I'm not really surprised because I've seen the power of community.
I'm forever indebted to you.
You don't owe me anything.
And although I don't owe you, the way that you showed up for me makes me want to forever be in service to you and to your work. Because It's transformational. I'm a testament to that. There's a lot of Celestes, and
There's only one Celeste.
yeah, there's only one me. But
That's just, I think, just a beautiful moment where you see this global movement where millions of people are involved, but you have to remember, you know, it's really about individuals. Movements are made up of millions of individuals, and that's an example of what it means to demonstrate empathy as a leader, to bring individuals along with you. And also, I just love the fact that she can say, you know, Celeste is just too smart for them. You know, I'm too smart for people to get away with that. And it's not arrogant or pushy. I just think it's confident, but humble at the same time. So it's a wonderful story. I would definitely encourage anyone who's curious about that to read the case. I found it very inspiring. It was really an honor to work on that case. Now I'm going to shift gears to the last P, which is projection. The protagonist in this case is Admiral Jim Stavridis, the former dean of the Fletcher School, actually, who was also the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. And in this case, what we do is we contrast. So he's a 4-star admiral, you know, the kind of highest level, one of the youngest ever in the history of the Navy. And his first 4-star assignment was in the Southern Command, SOUTHCOM, which is the Western Hemisphere based out of Florida. And his second was as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. And what is so nice about his working with him on this leadership case study is he was very open and honest about the first assignment. Didn't go well. He just said, the things I tried didn't stick, it didn't work. And he goes through all the reasons why not. He was focused on projection issues in both cases, but he didn't quite succeed in the first case, did in the second. So if we look at the SOUTHCOM experience, here's some of the projection things that he was trying to focus on. So one of the things he always hated, which I agree with, is in the US, they used to use these phrases. He would say, we have these terrible expressions like, that's really important because that's America's backyard. In other words, Latin America, right? That's America's backyard. Think about that, how that comes across to Latin Americans. Isn't that, you know, if you think about it, it's kind of outrageous. And he was sort of saying that sends an explicit and implicit message we got to change, right? So he worked very hard to change the way that we signaled what we think. For example, it was set up, the whole structure, he said, as a war-fighting machine. And he thought, we're not fighting a war in Latin America. We want to be collaborating on security, you know? He would say that when they say gringos, get out of here, you know, it's like, we're not invading your countries. Shouldn't be the way we present it. So he decided to try and shift things to be more collaborative. One example, Donna mentioned, I started my work in Nicaragua. I think this is a fascinating story. He decided to use some of the warships to be providing military medical aid. One was called the Comfort. So this is what he said. We sailed the Comfort, the medical aid ship, into the harbor, and Daniel Ortega came down and held a press conference on the pier in which he thundered, the Yankees are back with their warships. He took a breath and said, but this time they are on a mission of peace. Now, when I lived in Nicaragua, that was unimaginable. So that's an encouraging sign. Here's the problem. When he left, the next 4-star came in, was more of a traditionalist, and basically undid everything that Stavridis put in place. So when Stavridis had his debriefing with Robert Gates, the defense secretary at the time, Gates said, you know, you didn't drive the tent poles deep enough into the ground. That was the problem. So he moved to NATO and he realized, okay, I've got to do a lot more work, basically on all 4 Ps, he would say. And particularly, here's a couple of examples. He said, when you go into NATO, particularly as the American Supreme Allied Commander, you can quickly begin to feel as though you've got all the answers. And by the way, I would mention this happens to a lot of people in leadership positions. If you're in the powerful department within the company, if you're the donor with all the money, if you're coming from the bigger country to the smaller country, it doesn't really matter which industry or which sector. It's very easy to be put in a position where you feel that way. But this is what he said. You're representing the most powerful nation in the alliance. You're going to swing at that bat pretty hard to make sure the alliance does what you want. Boy, it doesn't work that way. NATO operates by consensus, which means the smallest nation can effectively say, you know what, we're not going to continue that mission in Afghanistan. You got to get all 30 nations to agree. Some of them as small ones, as small as Montenegro, Iceland, medium-sized ones like Bulgaria, Romania. You had to slow down and go see the Bulgarians, spend time going out on a little Icelandic patrol boat, go to Croatia and see why they're so concerned about incursion on the edges of the alliance. You have to learn. That was his goal. Not what a lot of people think of as an American 4-star going in and saying, I got to listen and learn and get out there and sit next to people. And it wasn't just so he could learn the content of their points. It was a signal. It was a projection of an important message, which is, I've got to listen and be by your side, all of you, if we're going to make this work, rather than what he did in the previous one in Southcom, which was kind of a top down, we're going to start using these words, like stop using backyard and start using collaboration. Doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So a very powerful lesson there. Let me just wrap up what I would say. Somebody asked me, could you just put it in one line? Like how do the 4 Ps work? They put it in one sentence. So I said, okay, in my view, great leadership involves building a vision from multiple perspectives, using an intentional and thoughtful process that connects with people on a compelling human level and projects a clear message of what your focus and priorities are for the future. So in a nutshell, for me, that is the 4P framework. There's lots more resources. I'll share this PowerPoint with you afterwards, of course, and you can look up all these cases and papers that I mentioned. And I suppose the final thing I would say is, I'll just stop sharing now. There's no finish line. None of these leaders that I talk to in doing these cases would say, okay, now I got it. Now I'm a great leader. All of them to a person say, this is a never ending process of continual refinement and improvement and preparation and reflection to build my leadership skills so I can continue to meet the moment, which continually changes. So it's not like maybe other things where you can kind of lock in progress and then you keep building on that. This is a fluid, constant dynamic that we have to keep relearning. So the humility of all these leaders is the thing that probably struck me the most. And I just found so remarkable and impressive, because it's not just about getting stuff done in our jobs or getting promoted at work or achieving a project. It's about managing all the things that matter to us in our lives, our relationships, our families. It's everything that's important to us in our lives grows out of our skills to manage, in my view, all of these 4 domains of leadership, these 4 Ps. So with that, I will stop there and be delighted to spend some time having a conversation with you on my presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Rob. That was just phenomenal. And I'm trying to get my video on here. There we go. Yeah, that was really something. Thank you. I myself, I have so many questions, but I cannot do that. I want to go to the Q&A box so that the audience can have their questions posed to you in comments. So Albert Young is asking you, Rob, what's your advice to put the 4 Ps at work in a negotiation?
So the number one piece of advice, I think, is the reason the paper is called Leading with Intentionality is about the idea that we have to force ourselves to stop and slow down and think about our next move. And that can even literally be in the moment. I use this phrase with my colleague, Nassim Curry. We've worked on this about see, scan, shift. What we mean is in the moment, even when you're having an emotionally charged interaction with somebody, to find the wherewithal to stop and see what's the problem here? What is going on? Am I, for example, am I in teaching mode or am I in learning mode? Am I triggering them or are they triggering me? What's happening here? And then think, okay, scan, what else might I be able to do here then? Maybe I should ask some questions. Maybe we should take a break. Maybe I should bring in some other people. Maybe there's some people who are here who shouldn't be here. To think about what are some options and then shift into a different strategy and then repeat. It's sort of a constantly iterative process. The best way, we have this colleague, Cizal Neely at the business school, who she happens to be an expert on many things, including process, that second P. She talks a little bit about trust sometimes, and she has this phrase I've always really liked. She says, because people say, what do you do when you have to work with someone who you can't quite trust? And she says, you know what the best way to trust someone is to trust them. It's a really hard thing to do. And so sometimes I say, what's the best way to put these ideas into practice? Guess what the best way is? Put them into practice. In other words, explicitly just try to ask yourself, well, what are the perspective questions at play here? How is it that other people are seeing this differently? I had a student who came to me who was a little skeptical last year, and he said, I don't see how to put this into practice. And I said, well, what's the next sort of thing you're working on? And he said, well, I have to go sit down with this group, this person we have a real problem with, a person in authority. And I said, well, who's we? Well, it's a group of us. And so I said, okay, let's take the 4 Ps. How would they be at play here? What perception issues are there? So, well, the perception issue is they did this, this, and this. I said, okay, great, that's your perception. What else? Well, I guess maybe the administration thinks this, and maybe this person thinks that. And okay, so now we're starting to see all these perceptions. What's your process? What are you gonna do? well, we're going to walk in and I'm going to explain the problem. And I said, okay, is it just you? Are other people talking? What's the order you're going to talk in? Are you going to ask questions first? You know, how's it going to work? What's the process? And we went down the list, and by the end they said, wow, I realize now I never thought of any of those things. So the real basic tip is take the 4 Ps and just ask yourself, how is that at play here? How are perceptions at play in this challenge I'm dealing with? Well, what are the emotional impacts I might be having on that person? What emotional impacts are they having on me? What messages am I sending? Am I meeting at their office, in my office, in somewhere else? So once you stop and just simply ask yourself the question, how are they at play here? All of a sudden, your mind starts to introduce these different ways of thinking about it, which most people I've worked with find it to be relatively, frankly, transformational in how they're approaching the whole problem. So just ask yourself, how are they at play? And that's the best starting point, I would say.
Okay, Rob, thank you very much. And here's another one. While one doesn't agree in a meeting, such disagreement should not be taken personally. Challenge arises to keep cool and don't lose focus when one of the team members makes disagreement as a personal rejection. How can you deal with that?
That one is a really interesting question. And here's what I would say. I would agree with all the premises of that question in terms of, you know, that's inevitably going to happen and people will challenge you, and it doesn't mean that they mean to hurt you personally. But there's one part there that I would say that I do kind of hear a lot and I wonder about. When people say, don't take it personally, I guess I would say it is personal. Yeah, it is personal. You can't not take it personally. If someone doesn't like your idea, a lot of us do work that we believe in, and we spend a lot of years working to build our skill set in. And we, in some cases, people think it's even their calling. So it is personal. Like I just wouldn't try to pretend to say, don't take it personally. But I think the other things that you said are right. That doesn't mean that that's their intention. It doesn't mean that they don't respect you or like you. It's going to be emotionally triggering, however, for you and me, all of us. So so if you listen to the podcast and do some more of the reading I sent, there's a lot of techniques out there that we can use to try to regulate our emotional response. Notice that's different than saying, don't have an emotional response. That really doesn't make sense, because as human beings, in terms of our brain science, we have to have emotional, we've survived because we have emotions. It's a survival mechanism. I think it's a real, I'd love to hear what Donna thinks about this as even more of a specialist than I am, but on this topic, I sort of feel like emotions gets a bad rap. It's like, if someone says you're emotional, that's not a compliment in our society, in most societies typically. I think that's a mistake. I think that we should be emotional. It's okay. I mean, to recognize that we're having an emotional response. How we demonstrate it or present it is another question. We're going to have emotions. So I think the first step is to not sort of beat yourself up that I'm taking it personally and I'm showing emotions. That's okay. It's just about how do we find that balance to grapple with the fact that we're having an emotional response. And there's a lot of great tools out there about breathing, about trying to be sometimes naming the emotion, to think about a process shift so you don't get quite so charged, or maybe a subject matter shift in the moment that engages a different part of your brain. There's lots of tools out there. For me, the starting point is accept that we will have emotional reactions, and that's okay.
Wonderful, Rob. Thank you. Another interesting question. These are all interesting, but what role does language play in the 4P process?
So interesting. And I'm assuming you mean language as in from different, say, countries, as opposed to the form of the language you're using. And I think that touches on a question that's so relevant to all the things we talk about in negotiation leadership, which is culture. Even in our own country, we have wildly different cultures. Even in Boston here, where I'm from, you know, it feels like a different culture. If I drive half an hour out to Western Mass or half an hour into downtown Boston, it's like different cultures. And there's a real debate in the scholarship about the importance of culture. I think there's lots of great books on how to negotiate across different cultures, how to lead across different cultures. And then there's some scholars who say, you know what, it's not really about culture. One of the most influential, William Zartman, some people have heard of, who's written a ton on negotiation and leadership and psychology. And he had this famous line. He said that the culture of the other person matters as much to the negotiation as what they had for breakfast. In other words, he's saying it's not the culture. That's like a red herring. It's really ultimately about the underlying interests and goals and concerns of that person. the way they express themselves varies wildly. So some cultures are more, they say high context or low context. We use lots of words around it in some places. Other cultures are just much more direct to the point. That's a presentation question, according to people in the school of thought of Zartman, as opposed to a substance question. And we can get overly affected by the form, and what his recommendation is to focus on the substance. I think the truth lies in between the two. When I've worked in different countries, and I can speak several languages quite badly, so I've been made fun of my terrible accent and that sort of thing in lots of different countries around the world. For me, it's the effort you're making to try to connect with that person that matters, and the effort you're making to understand what they're trying to convey to you. That's the interesting thing about empathy. I think a lot of people will know this word empathy, of trying to see the world from their perspective. And what the research shows about the brain science is that we don't actually ever have the ability to fully succeed in empathizing with someone. Why not? Because that means you're seeing the world as they see it. How can you exactly see the world as they see it? You'd have to be them in their head. Impossible. And on some level, the recipient of the information knows that. Our brains know that you can't succeed in being in our head. So what are we looking for on some level is the effort we're making to understand the world as they see it. And that, to me, is the best way I've found to try to transcend language differences. It's sort of the beauty of that is when people see that you can mess up the words and kind of trip over yourself a little bit, but they see what your intention is behind that. So I guess I wouldn't go so far as to say Zartman is right and it doesn't matter. And I wouldn't also go so far as to say, I hear people say, well, how do you work in this culture? It's so different. You know, in Japan, they think that signing a contract means it's just the beginning of the conversation. In the US, it's like the final thing. How do you work like that? Well, you know how you work like that? You use what we're talking about here, this whole seminar, working deeply to understand what their different perceptions are, the emotional impact on them, what's the message you think they're sending and that they're projecting versus what they think they're projecting. That's all hard work, but that's the work of, I think, leading across different cultures.
Very nice, Rob. Here's another question for you. How do you deal with your own limiting self-beliefs and being a leader practicing the 4 Ps?
Such an important question. And so I didn't break out the 4 Ps in the full detail. I showed that graphic, but one of the factors that I kind of consider is that for every one of those 4 Ps, there's almost like 8 categories. One is your internal perception, process management, human emotional impact, projection, and the external. And when it comes to projection, not only, most leadership, I think literature and a lot of the books focus on the ways that you project messages and the story you tell to the people around you, implicitly and explicitly. I think there's a big gap sometimes when we don't think about all of that applied to ourselves. The story we tell ourselves and the messages we send to ourselves. You know, we're often, in communication classes, we talk about different ways to send communication. You know, I think the most important communication conversation we're having every day is with who? Ourselves. And so I talked about Jim Stavridis, Admiral Jim Stavridis. He refers frequently to the importance of self-talk, thinking about how you talk to yourself. If you say, oh, I'm always an idiot, I always mess that up, or I'm really great at this, I never have a problem. We form a vision of ourselves by how we talk to ourselves often. And that's essential for effective leadership. And one step further, by the way, which is something I haven't seen much on, but we definitely have included in our 4P framework, is thinking a little bit about the gap or the distance between our internal projection, what we say to ourselves about who we are as leaders and negotiators and as people and as parents and as sons and wives and husbands and daughters and all that, and the external projection we send to people about ourselves. And the further apart that comes, the difference between our internal external projection, the harder it is to maintain a stance of authenticity. So we talk about authentic leadership. In a lot of ways, I think that authentic leadership is rooted in the distance between our self-talk and our external projection. Now, and people, I'm not saying you're off the hook by just putting them together. You know, just saying what you think doesn't mean, it's not like you have nothing else to worry about. But it's interesting that at the risk of introducing this name, 5 minutes left in this seminar, one of the things that people really liked about Donald Trump, supporters of Donald Trump would say the thing that they liked about him would be that the distance between those two things was very small. Now, critics of Donald Trump say he's not authentic, and it's not true. But people who liked him felt that what they imagined he would say to himself is exactly what he would say externally. Now, again, that doesn't get you off the hook for being a great leader just because there's no gap there. But if there is a big gap, then it's very hard to maintain any sense of authenticity. I mean, equally, Joe Biden supporters think he's very authentic because there's probably a very, so it's not to say pro-Republican, pro-Democrat, anti-Republican. It's just that's a factor in leadership and in negotiation that I think people on a subconscious level are looking for. Are there signs or is there evidence that your self-talk is different from what you're saying to me externally? And that's something that we have actually a reasonable amount of control over if we stop to explicitly think about it, but many of us are too busy to do that. So that would be the area of focus I would highlight.
All right, Rob, I think we have time for one more. And this is Lisa saying, thank you for this wonderful, this great presentation. How can leaders balance communicating empathically without appearing weak?
Yes, I know. I have even myself struggled with this. There's a sad stereotype, generally speaking, in many countries around the world that somehow showing emotion and showing a flexibility to take on board different ideas and change your mind is weakness. And I think that's a huge mistake. I don't think the literature supports that. And I think our personal experience doesn't really support that. Nevertheless, that's a very powerful sort of, I guess, kind of stigma almost out there about leaders, that you have to be strong and tough and decisive and have all the answers. And the essence of our whole paper is that's a myth, that there's this heroic leader that has all the answers, who shows up and just takes care of everything. I would also say that the other side is true. We can't just, like a needy leader who is always wondering, what do I do next? And just listening and always curious, but like not decisive. That doesn't help anyone either. If you're just needy all the time and unclear and confused, there's a balance. My general sense is that we're overly concerned about looking flexible and empathic and fearing that that will make us look weak. So most times the leaders I work with err on the side of looking decisive just because that's the image they think they need to project. And I think that's a mistake. I think we're looking at some really interesting examples of research around the COVID response around the world, and those open-minded leaders who show empathy and willingness to take on board new data, which is just coming in every single day as this is a new pandemic, have been the most effective. And I'm hoping that that will help to contribute to this conversation and slide the balance. Like I said, both extremes are not, or you want to avoid being decisive for the sake of being decisive and being completely undecisive because we're stuck and torn between what to do. In the middle is the comfort level of doing a bit of both and being unapologetic about doing both. To me is where a great leader can be. You know, you get knocked off balance and you can recenter yourself by recognizing it's okay at times to not have the answer, and it's okay at times to be clear even in the face of people disagreeing, and you have to pick both as the moment calls for. It's kind of like that saying that a plane is 90% of the time off course and it's constantly rebalancing to get to the destination. That's the way I would look at balancing the tension between being overly empathic and overly forceful.
Oh, Rob, that was a wonderful response, and everything today that you've presented to us was just so insightful and reflects deep wisdom. And I want to thank you, and on behalf of all of us who are sitting here listening to you. So thank you, thank you. And I would like to say before we end, you're planning on sharing the slides with people, correct?
Correct, exactly.
And one more thing, there has been a request that you include a list of books that you might recommend to people who want to learn more about this. Some other people that have influenced you, for example. So if you could include that as well, that would be terrific.
I would be delighted to. I have been accused of throwing out so many book references per second that it's like Rob's book club, but I will be I love sharing those kinds of suggestions, and I'd be delighted to, I notice in the chat there's lots of other suggestions. I will be certainly delighted to take a look at the chat later and hear what other people suggest and share the knowledge as this forum is exactly set up to do. So these are fantastic, insightful questions. It's been really a delight to spend time with all of you, and I will be happy to follow up with that information.
Well, Rob, there were so many more questions. We didn't get to them all. So that would be nice to just take a look at them because all of them were really thoughtful questions. And I want to say one last thing here, Rob, before we go, which is hello to our beloved Professor Herbert Kelman, who I know is listening. He's not here on camera, but he is listening. And I'm just so grateful to him that we are able to have this seminar with the Program on Negotiation in his honor. So hello, Herb, we love you, and thank you for allowing us to have this seminar.
Thank you all so much.
All right, thank you, Rob.